Welcome everyone, Questini here with a discussion about climate in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires and how it, especially when paired with aversion, a high level of aversion from the AI, can completely ruin a campaign. Even a perfectly good campaign with a pretty strong legendary lord. In fact, one of the strongest lords in the game, in this case, Grom the Paunch. But obviously this can apply to any campaign that finds itself in a similar situation. So, let's talk about the situation I find myself in. It's turn 56 in my Grom the Paunch campaign. I've conquered pretty much all of Wolf 1. Tyrion is dead. Alariel, I think, is down to basically one settlement somewhere around the map. I'm not entirely certain where she is because she's not in Terranok and she's not over here. Maybe she has the gate on this particular side, but not entirely certain about that. But either way, this campaign is over. In fact, it was over like 20 turns ago when I just smashed Tor of Res and killed Tyrion the first time around. And ever since then, it's been a mop-up operation against the High Elves. Now, when playing this campaign, when I decided to play this campaign, I thought to myself, okay, I do start in a situation where I have a bunch of unpleasant climate around me, which affects my control, construction costs, casualty replenishment, construction time, and income. But I figured, you know what, it's worth sticking around here for two reasons. A lot of the factions over here, the Imperial factions, the Bretonnian factions, the Dwarves, are certainly far easier to deal with than invading the very core of Wolf 1. Alariel, Tyrion, and Elfarion are just far stronger than Bretonnia and the Empire. That's one of the reasons. So I figured despite these downsides, it would be worth getting a lot of this territory and securing an economy because I can still generate a fairly decent amount of money. And Greenskins certainly don't necessarily have money issues in their campaign because they can earn so much from sacking settlements. Like I'm in a state where even a minor settlement will give me over 10k when I sack it. It is getting to the point of ridiculousness, and it's certainly how the greenskin situation currently is in the game. And Grom, and that's just the default greenskin situation, let alone the kind of benefits that Grom can get in growth, construction, whatever you name it, that's what you're gonna have. So certainly a lot of benefits in this campaign that do mask the issues that terrain types can cause. Now, usually speaking, when it comes to campaign guides, and when it comes to playing campaigns, it is advisable to avoid dealing with unpleasant climate. But you might think, well, I have a powerful legendary lord, let's go for it. I can conquer a good core of territory. But this will cause you significant issues in the long term, even if they don't cause you issues in the short term. So this campaign, for instance, can be amazing in the early game. You have a lot of fights, you have a lot of opportunities, you have a lot of ways this campaign can go. But in the late game, when you're trying to build a global empire, you realize just the severe limitations this causes you. So, you're going to spend more money to grow these settlements. And while this won't necessarily be an issue early on in the campaign, especially as the greenskins when you will be flush in cash, once you start getting to higher levels of structures and when structures start costing a lot of money, it will become a fairly major issue to tackle. That's the first problem when dealing with unpleasant climate. And of course, the benefits you're getting from these settlements are reduced than having suitable climate, in this case for Grom, Wolf 1. So those are some of the issues. It makes holding on to this territory far less meaningless in a campaign than it could be. Now, you might think, well, let's just bypass the territory and take territory that's suitable. There's a lot of problems with that kind of mentality. Certainly in certain campaigns, as a perfect example over here, I'll just talk about Morathi. If you're playing as Morathi, you start taking over this territory over here, but you don't hold on to it. You sell it to Mazda Mundi for diplomatic relations, and also because it's not worth holding on to it. And you expand across territory that is worthwhile, Nagarond, and then Ulfwan. That's the way you play a campaign as Morathi. You don't invest in the territory, you gain a lot of money from selling the territory to Mazda Mundi in that particular case. But that works for Morathi, and it works for a lot of legendary lords, because while she certainly has a high level of aversion, minus 40, it is a manageable level of aversion. You can have a very solid, very workable military alliance with Mazda Mundi as Morathi, with relative ease actually in your campaign. That, however, doesn't work in the case of Grom, because take the Empire for instance over here. Beyond all the other issues that do exist over here, In fact, there's so many things over here that it's hard to find it. But beyond those kind of issues that have been caused, I do suffer a minus 100 aversion against Imperial factions. At minus 100 aversion, it is basically impossible to maintain any kind of working diplomatic relation. Even if you do establish a military alliance in the first place, it will not last. This is something I learned playing my Noctilus campaign in the early days of Immortal Empires. When I tried allying Tyrion, allying the High Elves, giving Tyrion a lot of territory, it just didn't pan out. And then he declared war on me, broke the alliance, and just blew up in my face. So you can't overcome that kind of level of aversion. And even unpleasant climate is just going to create a lot of headaches in your empire because it's going to limit your potential. Now here's the problem this creates in a lot of campaigns, and the benefit races and lords that don't have to deal with climate types at all pretty much in their campaigns have. So in this campaign over here, I'll just use this as an example. The only settlement that that is close enough to me that has suitable climate is Massive Oracle, which I start with. All of Bretonnia is temperate, so it's unsuitable. That means the only territory that I can actually colonize are the mountains over here. But there's a problem with that. Because Bretonnia hates me, I'm going to have to go to war with them. And Bretonnia is also friends with the Empire, so the Empire is not going to like me. So all the territory I take here, I've had to fight campaigns to defend against the Empire. Marienburg sent a full stack against me, defeated one of my armies here, destroyed them easily once I sent the proper force over here to take them out. But I also have had to deal with Karl Franz, I had to deal with Kemmler, I had to deal with all of Bretonnia over here. And the issue is that there are some factions that are just not worth dealing with. Going into Lorem, sure, I could have won the fights over here, but if I had done so, then I would have just put myself squarely in Belegar's sights. And because I also enabled the endgame dwarf crisis, which, to be quite honest, I didn't expect that Carrick Ziflin would spawn 2 armies over here in the endgame crisis. I expected Belegar to be sure, but I didn't expect Carrick Ziflin. That's going to create a lot of problems if I continue playing this campaign. That meant that actually expanding here would have been a really, really bad idea. Lots of money, lots of effort, and my campaign anyway wants to take me to Ulthuan. And I was kind of on the clock to go in Ulthuan because I know that if I linger in my core starting territory, I can do so to a certain extent, about 20 turns, 30 turns or so. That's the point at which Noctilus and Nakari, who I killed here, that's the point when they start losing their campaigns. Like, that's the turning point for the High Elves when Alariel, Elfarian, and Tyrion just completely take over all of Ulthuan. And if you have to deal with all of Ulthuan at once, even as Grom the Paunch with all his substantial power, that is going to be a bitter struggle. Still, I decided to go west. But here's the problem that's been created in this campaign, beyond the endgame crisis, right? At this point, I've effectively won the campaign. I won it a long time ago, just questions of dealing with the settlements, but I'm like less than 20 settlements I'm going to occupy in order to achieve the endgame crisis. I could have achieved it far faster if I had decided to invade Ulthuan, and Force could have probably beaten it by, I don't know, turn 40, maybe even earlier, if I was really, really aggressive, and if I had let the Bretonnian factions fight each other with Kemmler and the Red Duke. Might have worked out a lot better in the end. So, mistakes were made. But here's the issue. And this goes beyond the early game issue, where you might not necessarily care too much about unpleasant climate. Either bypass it or take it and just take the penalty. Well, the long-term issue is right now I'm having to think about an empire. So I have 3 armies over here in Ulthuan, 2 armies over here to just deal with Be'lakor, and a final army that I'm recruiting here in Massive Oracle just to act as a defense force. The problem that I have in this campaign going forward, if I were to continue it, and this is where the real issues get caused, you can deal with unpleasant climate early on. Beyond, sure, your economy is going to be slower, the control is going to be slower, but when you're dealing with a vast swath of territory and you're having to spend thousands of gold just to upgrade structures because of the increased construction cost, then it becomes a major issue in terms of expansion. So it makes a lot of the territory pointless. You don't want to bother with it. So what do? You obviously look for territory that is viable. The problem in a campaign like Grom the Paunch, Katep, and others is that territory that is viable for them can be really far away. So the only territory that Grom has over here that's viable is obviously mountains and Ulthuan itself. Now, there are some mountains over here in the Southern Grey Mountains, but to take those, that would basically mean dealing with Gelt, dealing with all of Lorem, so a lot of headaches would slow down your campaign. And then, of course, you've got Belagar over here, and then you hop on from these mountains. Even if you conquer them, you hop on over into the Badlands, where there's even more factions waiting for you, ready to ruin your day. So lots of issues that can be created over here just by terrain types, because it means that the only territory that you have viable in this campaign, for instance, is Ulthuan, and then you have a massive gap between Ulthuan and the Badlands and the Dwarven lands that is suitable, beyond some provinces over here that do have mountains that you can settle in, but also very exposed provinces. And when it comes to building an empire, you never want your empire to look like a string like this. This is one of the issues that Forik has in his campaign, one of the main issues actually. Because if you're playing as Forik, the best thing you can do to achieve a fast campaign would be to move from here continuously north, but that leaves you very exposed to factions from the west and from the east. Krogar is not necessarily your friend. In fact, he likely becomes your enemy. So that means you're building an empire that's basically a string of territories held together in a straight line that's very, very exposed to a lot of factions. You need to protect your flanks. And if you can't protect your flanks because the territory is unsuitable, then that's a major issue. Usually the way you solve this is via diplomacy. But what happens when diplomacy ceases to be an option, which is certainly the case in this particular campaign? Well, then, to put it politely, you're screwed, more or less. You're screwed in your potential in terms of how much you can achieve in this campaign. And this is, as one of the most powerful and most potent legendary lords, who never will run out of money, who you have to try really, really hard and recruit a lot of armies to try and run out of money, who can literally print money, but even so, it limits your potential. And this is something that happens in far more campaigns than you might realize, even in campaigns that are ridiculously easy and really powerful. For instance, if you're playing Tyrion, you have a lot of potential early game. You can conquer all of Ulthuan, you can get all of the territory in Nagrand, get a vast swath of territory. The question is, what do you do then in the campaign? Because all the territory after that point is just kind of going to be a money sink that you're going to pour vast resources in to make it useful, and it's never going to be as useful as the territories that have suitable climates. And this means fundamentally that the factions and that the races and legendary lords that don't have to deal with this with the terrain type situation have a much better situation. For instance, the Dark Elves can occupy the Chaos Wastelands. Well, Malekith can at any rate, and Helebron as well, and also Marathi. Malekith can occupy Chaos Wasteland, so he actually has much better potential in his campaign because he can conquer a vast swath of territory over here. He can also take frozen territory. So unlike the High Elves, he can take all of Ulthuan, he can take all the frozen territory, and he can take all of the chaotic wasteland on the campaign map, which means his campaign potential is actually higher. Or rather, Marafi's campaign potential is much higher because she has a generally better campaign. So that's the issue with terrain types. It creates a major imbalance in a lot of campaigns. And sometimes you have a campaign like Grom the Paunch, where obviously that can be mitigated somewhat by the faction effects. But even then, you realize that the faction effects, while they're very useful to mitigating it in the early game, at one point, just the sheer amount of territory you want to take, the sheer amount of territory you're dealing with, will overcome that. It will become a net cost on your empire. And I think that this is something Creative Assembly should look at in terms of improving a lot of campaigns. Not necessarily Grom's campaign, to be very, very clear. I think he would be absolutely ridiculous if he could take temperate climate, but he does have a major problem in terms of expanding across the world. But you can still win this campaign, don't get me wrong, and you can have a lot of fun doing so. But imagine a campaign like Katep, and not just Katep. Karl Franz, for instance, is limited because he can't take the mountains. Well, he can, but it's going to be it's going to drain his economy to do so in his campaign. That's one of the reasons Gelt is in a much better position, because Gelt can colonize mountains in a campaign. Effectively, the more climate types you can deal with, the more potential you have in your campaign. If you have fewer climate types, you have you have more limitations. One of the main things that makes Oxyatl so ridiculously strong in his campaign is that he can colonize across the entire world with no penalties whatsoever when it comes to terrain. And he can also teleport around the entire world. That gives him a lot of power, flexibility, potential in his campaign. Costinier signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.